buenas tardes, or buenos días, depending on where you are. Mi nombre es Lourdes Rodriguez, and it is a pleasure to invite you into my kitchen with my neighbors and have an opportunity to enter into conversation and reflect on the yesterday's discussions and this morning discussions, and a little bit of a kitchen cabinet discussion of how all of these themes apply to our work, apply to our thinking, and our work moving forward. I want to start by doing a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what now is called North America. I am currently in the land of the Alabama, Cushata, Caddo, Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coahualtecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan, Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas, where I am, where my kitchen is at. I would like to start by inviting my neighbors to introduce themselves and share what perspectives they'll bring. Mi nombre es Lourdes Rodriguez, and I currently serve as Senior Program Officer for Women's Health at St. David's Foundation. I am a member of the Roundtable on Population Health Improvement, and I am bringing a public health perspective to this conversation today. Monique, would you like to go next?
Good morning, everybody. I would like to introduce myself. Yad Ebene, Shea Monique Sosi and Shea be between Shlodot Kadazaki Bashichin, Sina Jenny Dashache, Lots what's Nib Dashanella, Shea Dene, Asan Shlo. Good morning, everybody. My name is Monique Sosi, and I am originally from Tuba City, Arizona. I am full Navajo, and I currently serve as a program analyst for the Intertribal Council of Arizona, based in Phoenix, Arizona. I just introduced myself in my language and just recognized my 4 clans that represents who I am and what I take from my mom and dad's side. I'm currently in Phoenix. I am on the Tono Otham and Peeposh land. And but yeah, I'm excited. I'm sorry, but I got my times mixed up. So I was a little late on the conversation, but I really enjoyed the last talk, so I'm looking forward to further sharing.
Well, Monique, you know, when you walk into the kitchen, anytime is a good time. So I'm so glad that you made it. Alejandra.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alejandra Hernandez. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm bringing a philanthropy perspective today. I'm an environment fellow at the Kresge Foundation. I'm relatively new to the foundation, but I'm hopeful to contribute to this amazing conversation. And thank you for hosting us in your kitchen, Lourdes.
Anytime. And Dawn, I would like to invite you to go next.
Thank you, Lourdes. It is delightful to have this opportunity to share a virtual coffee in your kitchen. I am Dawn Alley, a member of the Population Health Roundtable. Recently joined Morgan Health, a business unit of JP Morgan Chase, as head of healthcare innovation, and came from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services before that. So I'm going to try to bring both a private sector and government perspective to this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to take a moment to just invite everyone that is in the audience today, that is, you know, here with us this morning, to use the Slido portion of the screen. So if you look right underneath the webcast screen, to add your reflections, your questions, and your own call to action, so that you too can be part of the conversation. I want to start us off by thinking about that first, the keynote address that was moderated by Robert Semper in conversation with Myla Vicente Carpio, Karen Mamoto, and Mindy Fulilov. They set the tone by reflecting on multiple examples of spatial injustice from the perspective of Indigenous, Japanese American, and African American communities. And they did that both as scholars and as members of those communities. I don't know about you guys, but for me, one of the things that blew my mind was this notion of thinking about history not as a series of events, right? But thinking about history as structure, right? Like that invitation made me think about the world very differently, right? Because there's so many connections, but also because structures are a lot more enduring than events, right? Events have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but structures exist so long as we use them, as we believe them to be true. So to me, that allowed me to start thinking about myself as a public health practitioner in a very different way, right? Because I can think about the impact of structures rather than the impact of events. I also welcomed very much how the framework offered about how urban planners think about spatial justice, right? Accessibility, mobility, habitability, and then this new perspective was added of epistemology, right? So talking about not only the physicalness of space, but the culture, the knowledge system, and the ways in which we understand the world, and how that shapes our attachment to place and our understanding of spaces. And then the other concept that resonated with me was this concept of serial forced displacement, that that if you think about populations that have experienced spatial injustice, that experience is recreated over and over and over again. It's not static, and it's something that the trauma related to that displacement accumulates. So ladies, what were your thoughts with that keynote address? What stayed with you?
I'll jump in and note that I think that keynote was where the term erasure entered this conversation over the last couple of days, which just seemed so important and so much more direct than talking about displacement and relocation, like the cultural implications of that, as well as Professor Umamoto's remarks about what she hears from her students. She said that they feel anger, frustration, and inspiration. And I think that was so much of the conversation than, what we had in the last couple of days. How do we turn that anger and frustration into inspiration and action?
What really stayed with me was the framing, right? As someone who works in the philanthropy space, I think it's crucial to really, reflect and sit with the frame of settler colonialism that we still live in, and the impacts on our practices. And just, how does settler colonialism still inform our practices as we do foundation work? And are we still in the process of perpetuating injustices? So that's something that I really sat with, and want to continue to sit with and invite people in philanthropy to reflect on.
Maybe if I turn the mute on, that's what happens when you're in the kitchen. On the second conversation, the title Climate Change, Displacement, and Population Resilience. This was moderated by you, Alejandra. You were in conversation with Eric Kleinenberg and Vivek Chandas. You want to tell us a little bit about how it went?
Sure. I just want to say I was so humbled and so honored to moderate that conversation. I was a bit starstruck. They're amazing sociologists doing amazing work. So Dr. Eric Kleinenberg and Dr. Vivek Chandas just underscored that place really matters, and the displacement also matters in how we are experiencing climate change. The policies of segregation, redlining, for example, have really resulted in spatial inequities. So in the same city, some neighborhoods are experiencing more urban heat than others, for example. And social infrastructure can make the difference on who is more resilient to climate change. are there stoops, for example, that people are conversing on? Is there access to libraries, etc.? So what is the infrastructure that is able to help bring communities together and make them more resilient to these changes in climate? And then they left us with very powerful questions, and that we already know who are vulnerable peoples, but how are we uplifting their power, their voices, and the monies? Where is the money going?
One of the things that I was left with after that conversation was that, we understand, this was a comment that I think Eric made, we understand how everyday inequalities translate to large scale events. Like, we know this, we have the data, no more research needs to be done. But then why then is our knowledge not used to prevent these catastrophes, right? Like, what is Julianne Egeman said, where is the political will? Where is the allocation of resources that is going to help us prevent these grand scale catastrophic events like the ones that were shared yesterday? And also, like, the importance of shifting the burden of proof from individuals to systems and processes, right? Because we have the data, we understand what the dynamics are, and that being in a place of vulnerability is not about individual choices, it's about the systems that create those vulnerabilities. I thought it was really powerful.
I agree, and some of those same things stuck out at me. I think one other thing that we just can't let go unremarked is the value of maps as a tool, which I think came up in that conversation as a way of engaging people and really visualizing these inequalities. The example from Portland of the huge temperature differences in a single city is definitely something that will stay with me.
I missed a conversation, but I always enjoy hearing Alejandra talk about the climate change, but also your conversation regarding just the data and the research and how it impacts from the communities that we work with, the tribal communities. And I speak on behalf of the Arizona and what our experiences are, and the value around data sovereignty and how to use that. I know we are collecting a lot of research and data, but how is that going to benefit our communities, especially when we have remote rural areas, and how they have capacity to use those data and how are they reading it is kind of the structure we are at, but also acknowledging, and I think the previous conversation was acknowledging the communities, that there are 22 tribes in Arizona, and not much of the residents of Arizona understand that, and how do they acknowledge and accept and understand and recognize the communities within, and trying to be that voice, especially in climate change, when tribal communities, but also indigenous communities rely on the land, and we are very connected to the land. So it's very an impact for us.
Thank you. That reminded me of the comment that Myla said that we are all, I think it was Myla, that we are all indigenous to somewhere, right? Like, and if we don't make that recognition and seek what the our connection to land is or was, if we have moved around, it's hard to think about a path forward. Then we wrapped up Monday, if you remember, with a 4-way conversation about how policies and investments shape spatial injustice and displacement. And this was a conversation moderated by Oscar Perriabello, who brought a journalistic perspective, Michael Bader, who brought a sociological perspective, Thomas Mitchell, who brought a legal perspective, and Megan Venable Thomas, who brought the perspective of housing and community developers. I think that Dawn, that conversation struck you, right?
Absolutely. I'm always really wanting us to move beyond conversations about political will, though that's so important, and sort of starting the conversation to what can we do about it. And so I love the discussions of the policy opportunities. I think a key theme from that discussion that's true of really the whole 2 days, but came home in that conversation, was that it's important to acknowledge is that the injustices we're talking about have been intentionally created and exacerbated over multiple generations. And that means that if we're going to do something about them, it's going to take coordinated, intentional, systematic action. And the presenters identified a couple of really specific examples there that I appreciated. Thomas Mitchell talked about the heirs property standard law, and thought it was tremendously exciting to see an example of state-based statutory framework that's been implemented in 18 states, and shows once you develop a template for something, how that can take off. With a lot of hard work that I want to come back to on another really interesting discussion about messaging as part of that conversation. Megan Venable Thomas mentioned the opportunity to leverage processes like the qualified allocation plans for low-income housing tax credits. So the idea that we should attach requirements to capital, and that those requirements can actually include criteria around the process itself. Like, did we engage communities? Did we look at the particular impact on and engage communities most at risk of climate-related events? And think that feels like such an important way to change the actual structure of decision-making to make sure that we are engaging communities as a matter of course and not as an after the fact, and not as an afterthought. Michael Bader talked about the importance of also thinking about the suburbs. We're having a lot of conversations about urban areas, but the growth of racial and ethnic minority populations in the suburbs, and a variety of access issues in that context, and in particular the role of healthcare systems as one place to start addressing those inequities. And then I'll note that for myself, sitting in JP Morgan Chase, I was really struck by Oscar Periobeo's comment about the decline of Black-owned banks, and this piece of structure and commercial and market structure in neighborhoods. There was a really interesting discussion at the end about, I think, the opportunities and dangers of race-blind messaging, and it connected in my mind with what Julian Aguiman said in the conversation right before this, that you don't get to social justice, you need to start with social justice. But part of the conversation was, do you lead the messaging with social justice? Where does it work better to have a really inclusive message around something like property rights, and where is doing that actually obscuring the important conversations that need to have about historical inequities? So those were the themes that really stood out in my mind.
There's a short video that Mindy Fulilov's team put together to articulate what serial forced displacement is. It's called The Domino Effect. You can check it out on Vimeo. And when I was listening to this panel, in the comments that Thomas Mitchell was sharing, it made me think about that, about the domino effect of, back-to-back forms of displacement, like government-endorsed forms of displacement, right? Like eminent domain, foreclosure, and others that are intentional, that are sold as race neutral. But when you scratch the surface, you realize that they're not necessarily race neutral. I mean, if you think about urban renewal, racist ways to value spaces based on who was living there, they were written into the forms that were used to determine the value of neighborhoods, right? Like, so being able to call it what it is and not shy away from calling it out so that we can undo the harms created by those intentional policies, it's really important. And I think that Megan mentioned that intentionality. And I'm telling you, like, I have an amazing academic crush with everyone in that panel for so many reasons. But one of the reasons is this understanding of how, like, they articulate very nicely the generational harm of spatial injustice, right? And there was a phrase, I had to write it down, that Megan said, holding power with you, not over you. And in her work as a practitioner, as somebody who comes to housing and community development, that is a powerful statement to make. And you have to bring that with you when you enter into spaces. Oh my gosh, we could go on and on forever. But I want to make sure that we also talk a little bit about the conversation that we just had a few minutes ago. It was thought-provoking. It brought together concepts, strategies, frameworks, and policies for spatial justice. It was moderated by Richard Jackson in conversation with Julian Agiman, who brought a planning perspective, Robin Bronen, who brought a legal and practitioner of social justice perspective, and Juan de Lara, who brought a geographer and scholar of immigrant and working class communities perspective. So, this just happened 2 seconds ago, so y'all were there, so we're not gonna go into a lot of details, but I wanna just any other thoughts or things, takeaways that were left with you in those conversations.
Yeah, one of the things that really stuck with me is, as we're thinking about adaptation and who's being impacted, it's like, how do you make sure that there's an approach where the community is part of the decision making, that they lead the decision making, that their voices are heard, that they have the resources to be able to make those decisions in time. So the autonomy of the community, the sovereignty of the community.
Yep.
And I think I bounce off of Alejandra's comment, and that one is kind of stuck with me regarding the data to be updated with the community, for the community. It's kind of one of the things I enjoy stressing, but I enjoy to read about is working with the community and also developing that relationship. And that is where it should begin, in kind of accepting and how their lifestyle, because each community is different. Just for us, I am Navajo, but I cannot speak on behalf of like an Apache, because I needed to develop that relationship, and also recognizing, but also one of the other things that stood out was the measuring of success. I think we all each have different definitions of what the measuring of success might be, especially with the rural community, is maybe speaking their language might be the measure of success. So that was what really stuck out to me.
Thank you so much. I want to remind our audience that you can use the Slido space right underneath the webcast video to ask your questions and share your comments. And we received our first question, and kudos, because y'all don't hold back. So this is a question for all of us to ponder here. And it says, Haitian migrants at the border abused by agents on horses with whips underscores racialized policy implementation. Can we undo anti-Black racism? That is a tough one, and not the first time that we've talked about that in this kitchen. So, thoughts about undoing anti-Black racism? I will start by saying that, and whoever sent this question, thank you very much. I will start by saying, bringing together three thought lines that were brought together by three different speakers. One was a reflection by, an invitation and reflection by Mindy Fulalov that talked about how the work that she and her team did through the 400 years of inequalities invited people to think about how the way that this country was built and the lives and the impact of the experience of slavery that people brought forcefully to this country in the slave trade, like how that is not disconnected from everybody's experience, right? She talked about a timeline that she and her students put together that followed the history of slavery, the history of the labor movement of workers, the history of women's rights, and the history of, indigenous people over those same 400 years. And in that exercise, you could see that we, our destinies are a lot more closely linked than we let ourselves to think. So for me, as a Puerto Rican woman living in the mainland, the fight to undo anti-Black racism, it's also about the plight of Puerto Ricans who are living in the context of colonialism, right? As a territory of the United States. So for me, undoing anti-Black racism means recognizing how my life is also touched by that racism. And if I don't stand up in solidarity with my Black brothers and sisters, then I cannot expect that type of solidarity in the plight of Puerto Rican people, whether in the island or in the mainland. So that's what I'm thinking about. How about others?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that. I grew up with a Latinx background. I'm a daughter of immigrants, and I just feel like my fight is definitely tied to Black liberation as well. Like my people won't be liberated in there. And there's just so much intersectionality between our fights and history of oppressive colonization that really, binds us together. So I just wanted to offer that thought.
I think for me, almost any answer to this question feels like a drop in the bucket in the sense of the historical legacy that we are talking about and the issues we've discussed in the context of the workshop around intentional multi-generational creation of the systems that we have today. But I also think it's critically important that we not let the sheer size and complexity of this issue let us off the hook for directing it, addressing it head on and taking action. And I will just share one small piece of this, again, coming from an industry perspective, which is that JP Morgan Chase has made a $30 billion commitment to racial equity over 5 years. And one thing I found myself reflecting on in the context of the workshop was a specific piece of that is around investments in Black and Latinx operated lending institutions, community development, financial institutions, and other financial institutions, and including minority deposit institutions. And that's not to say, again, that this single kind of investment is going to be the thing that turns the tide on generations of racism and oppression. But again, I think we have to start somewhere, and it's really important that major institutions begin to really concretely invest in these areas.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And your comment makes me think how the biggest barrier to anti-racist work is inertia, right? Like we feel overwhelmed and we feel like the one drop is not going to make a change, but it does. Unless anybody else wants to take a chance at that question, I'm going to go ahead with the next question. It says the earlier panel didn't get to this question, but I wonder if this group can reflect, based on your experience, on how we ought to work across sectors and disciplines. I have some thoughts, but I talk too much, so I'm going to let others take that question. How we ought to work across sectors and disciplines to advance spatial justice.
I think we have to look for opportunities to really concretely weave this into our processes. I was thinking, as I was hearing some of the presentations, about the movement a few years ago that I think has since slowed down somewhat, but around health impact assessment. And when we look at different policies, trying to really concretely look at the health and health equity implications of those policies, and that by weaving in that kind of a required element in the process, that we have an opportunity to catalyze those multi-sector conversations. I also found myself thinking about, and I think this is part of the question, but this piece, not just around sectors, but around bringing communities in. I mentioned that I recently left the federal government, and the federal government, of course, uses notice and comment rulemaking as a regulatory way to seek public input. But we often found that the public input was really industry input, because of course, like, those entrenched stakeholders are the ones that are paying attention to potential regulations that might affect them. And, what would it look like to try to look for opportunities to broaden that conversation, or have requirements around different kinds of engagement that go beyond posting something in the Federal Register? So to me, those process points to bake the multi-sector engagement in feel like a great opportunity.
I totally agree with what Dawn mentioned. And I also want to underscore that it's important to work, like, in foundation work, we also work in silos. So I think it's important to do that internal work to make sure that we understand the intersectionality of our own funding streams and work to make sure that it's robust, and we are looking long-term for grantees as well.
I think one of the areas is working, as you said, with communities, but also listening to the community stories and kind of shaping that around, but also defining what is spatial justice for them and how are they defining that language.
Thank you so much, Monique. Storytelling can be so powerful, and so long as there's a proverb, so long as I'm gonna butcher it. So long as the hunter is the one who gets to tell the stories, we will never know the stories of the lions, right? So if we do not bring multiple perspectives to a situation, we're gonna be stuck with the perspective of whoever is in a position of power. All right, so I wanna make sure that we have time for a call to action and next steps conversation. So I am going to invite each one of you lovely people to share what the implications are for your work and what is your call to action. And I'm going to start with Dawn. Dawn, could you talk a little bit about how these 2 days of conversation are going to have an impact on your work in the private sector?
I'm going to take really seriously the idea of holding power with you, not over you. That's it in a nutshell, I think. There's so much more, but the role of business as anchor institutions in their communities, and the many choices that we make about priorities, and ensuring that the voices of the people that we employ and the communities we serve are have a prominent place in that decision making.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I'm looking at you, Alejandra. I'm gonna ask you about implications for action in the philanthropic sector, and I'm gonna add a few of my own thoughts there, but please go ahead.
Yeah, so for me, I just want to repeat again that making sure that we understand as foundations and philanthropies, we are navigating a settled colonial state, and we need to make sure that our practices aren't, leading to unjust practices, and reflecting on how philanthropy can also be burdensome to communities. Like, what are our practices that we can adapt or change that can make it easier for our grantees, because they are dealing with crises, right? We're in a pandemic, we're dealing with climate change. So how can we make sure that our processes are less burdensome? Making sure we spend money, leverage funding. So we know other funders. How do we leverage funding and get money to communities that are on the ground, on the front lines, and listening to their intelligence, listening to their leadership?
Thank you so much, Alejandra. Monique, I want to invite you to think and share with us what the implications are and what's your call to action based on the conversations of the 2 days on spatial justice.
Thank you for having me in this space in your kitchen. Right now, our current work is climate change, but also health research. I think a lot of it is the next process of developing training workforce for our community and seeing how they can use the data, as we were talking about, to benefit their community, but also recognizing that for funders, our communities are always looking for funding, but also how can we use that to benefit the community to move forward, but also training the individuals so they can be working within their own community. And it's developing the recognition also that we are still here, the Indigenous people, and that we are still working very hard to move forward and trying to adapt to the current changes, and they are very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monique. So I feel like I want to talk about 3 different things. Riffing off of your comments, Alejandra, about the role of philanthropy, because that is where I am right now. I can think of, coming to our work with 2 lenses, one of trust and one of strengths-based approaches. Because when we come with trust, we understand that the way of understanding the world that our grant partners, our community colleagues bring is just as valid as the one that we bring with our own experiences of the world. And that, oftentimes the mechanisms of philanthropy that we use for documentation, for validation, they are not necessarily based on trust. They're based on prove to me that your work is valid and useful and needed. So bringing trust. And then the strengths-based approach is about understanding that I'm going to speak for the place where I'm working right now. We are not an operational foundation, but we have a strategic plan. We have work, goals that we set for ourselves. But it is with, our grant partners, our grantees are the hands and feet and the heart and the brain that is going to allow us to get to that strategy, get to implement that strategy. And so that by force means that we need to think about them as coming with strengths and assets that we don't have. And so for the sector of philanthropy working in spatial justice issues, that's my call to action: to trust and to come with strengths-based approaches. And then I feel like we need to talk a little bit about evidence and training, right? I used to be a researcher at one point in my life, and I used to be a professor at one point in my life. And so these 2 things are near and dear to my heart. In the side of research and evidence, and if anybody else wants to comment on those 2 things, please unmute yourselves. On the side of evidence, I feel like we have already enough data to inform policies and practices. Again, going back to our understanding of inequalities in the day-to-day, the comment that Eric made, and how that then reflects in how large-scale disasters are experienced by different people. If we know the data, then we need to muster the political will to use that data to inform our policies and practices, right? So that any new evidence contributes to our understanding of how the old evidence that we already have, the data that we already have, has informed policies and practices, right? And then in terms of training or workforce needs, it seems to me that across disciplines, we need to have a shared understanding of how the knowledge generated in one area can inform the work in another, right? So the knowledge generated in sociology informing public health, the knowledge generated in public health informing planning, the knowledge generating in planet informing law, and so that requires creating spaces for shared scholarship across disciplines. Like when we do that, we're going to have an opportunity to come to our work with more strength and with a better understanding of what is ours to do to improve population health. So I just had to add those things. The prerogative of it's my kitchen, so I get to add more stuff. But others who wanna add anything about evidence, research, or training in workforce before we pass the mic over to Kirsten.
I would just add on the evidence piece, and I think this is sort of implied in what you said, Lourdes, but I want to underscore it as the importance of issues around, communication research about how, and then also like how do we engage with people at scale on these issues. I think we heard about a lot of amazing work that can happen when we sort of get people in either a real or virtual room together, and we get them looking at maps, and when we hear from communities, those are really on the ground labor intensive ways to create change. And so we heard about that, and then we heard about things like state level policy change and how do we bridge those gaps. And so to me, a big part of this is about the communications and public engagement kinds of research.
I think I'll bounce off Dawn's statement regarding gaps, especially for us for research and data. I know for our tribes, we have to have several steps. It's tribes, the counties, and then the states. So in that area is how are we going to put that divide and that gap back together to use the data and to benefit the community. Just as you mentioned, Lourdes, that we do have so much data, but how are we going to use it, and how are we going to use it in a positive way, especially with the history of research within American Indian communities, is how is it going to benefit them?
I want to touch on the training workforce. There's something that Megan said in yesterday's panel that stuck with me, the intentionality of who's doing the development, who's building the housing infrastructure. And our last panel talked about, like if we had money, like what would we be doing, creating the world we want to see? So the training and workforce who are, we need more people that are from the community that are getting the training and the resources to build the communities they want to live, work, and play in. Just building the world that is more just, more equitable, and just more community oriented.
Thank you so much. And with that, I want to say thank you to all of the audience that stuck with us over the past 2 days. Thank you for sharing your questions and your thoughts and your comments. And I now want to pass along the mic to my colleague Kirsten Vivins Domingo, co-chair of the Roundtable on Population Health Improvement. Thank you, and until next time.